Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Now, as you know, by now I'm sure, I recently introduced a brand new book entitled Temple to Telos. The premise of this book is that according to Hebrews chapter 9, 6 to 10, the temple that was standing when Hebrews was written, with the cultus, it's not strictly and exclusively about the temple, but that is inextricably bound up with it. Because you see, the writer makes a point of saying, and he talks about that, the meats, the drinks, the carnal washings, and what have you, and says those things which were part and parcel of the temple cultus would stand valid until the time of Reformation. Now, the point I make in the book is that first century temple was standing valid when the first 4 feast days were fulfilled. The question, therefore, becomes, if that first century temple was standing and, most importantly, standing valid for the fulfillment of the first 4 feast days, then upon what basis could it be argued that that very same temple and its cultus would not have to be standing and valid, perhaps, for the fulfillment of the final 3 feast days? Well, my goodness gracious. The implications of this are absolutely astounding, ladies and gentlemen. As I say in my book, this is a theological atom bomb. We might even say it's a hydrogen bomb. It is incredible because you see, that temple is no longer standing. The cultus is no longer valid, no longer binding. So since the temple, the priesthood, the sacrifices are no longer valid, then guess what? The time of Reformation must have either come, which means the coming of the Lord judgment resurrection has already come, or the fulfillment of those feast days failed to be fulfilled while that temple, which is the one that was standing valid when Hebrews was written. And you see, the writer is clear. He's not talking about a future temple. He's not talking about a future cultus, a future priesthood. And he's not talking about the past priesthood or feast days or what have you. He is talking in the present tense about the temple and the priesthood, the sacrifices, the feast days that were still valid when he was writing, just like Paul wrote in Colossians chapter 2, 16 and 17, when he said that the new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths were present active indicative, when he wrote, shadows of the good things that are about to come. Now, as I've pointed out, unless you can prove that Hebrews was written after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, after the priesthood was removed, after the sacrifices were removed, then the fact that Paul in Colossians says those feast days were still shadows of the things that were about to come, and since Hebrews talks about those things in the present tenses, hello? So, needless to say, there have been a lot of objections written to me on YouTube, even Facebook, some privately, but most publicly. Now, I've got 3 pages of objections given to me by one individual, a very cordial guy. I really appreciate that. And he's made several observations, several claims, several arguments. I do not know that I'm going to be able to cover them, but let me make this observation. One of the objections that I go into great detail about, and my discussion is to be found in my book, Israel 1948, Countdown to Nowhere. And the reason I say that right at the very beginning is that this individual says, well, Israel was to return to the land prophetically, and that happened in 1948. Ladies and gentlemen, 1948 had absolutely nothing to do with the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. Okay, got to go on. His very first objection is this: the festivals do not need for the first century or any standing temple to be fulfilled. The Bible nowhere says that. Just a tent or a tabernacle is all that is required, which can be erected in a few days, as in Moses' day and for many centuries thereafter. That's all that is needed. Well, you see, folks, this objection is itself ironic. What this objector is saying is, well, okay, you may not need a temple, but you got to have a tabernacle. Why? Well, because the tabernacle and the temple were only valid as long as the law of Moses and the Levitical priesthood themselves were valid, binding, and imposed. But it's so ironic that this individual would say, well, you don't need a temple. And then guess what he does? Turns right around and tells us that he's waiting for the construction of the future temple. In fact, he says, the Levites who are qualified to be priests have been in training for quite a while now and are ready to serve when called upon. Well, you see, he's referring to the Jerusalem, the Temple Institute. Wait a minute. Temple, not tabernacle, not tent, Temple Institute. So on the one hand, he wants to negate the importance of the temple, saying, oh, all you got to do is have a tabernacle sometime in the future. But that's not what he believes. He believes that the supposed, more on that momentarily, the supposed Levites are in training for what? A future temple. So, and I say this kindly and with all due respect, that's double talk. Don't tell me that a temple is not important and then turn around and tell me we're waiting for a future temple, which is the key, the crux for futurist eschatology. Now, let me point out, I have said this over and over and over again. I well understand, okay, that sacrifices were offered long before even the tabernacle was constructed. I understand that sacrifices were offered before the temple was ever constructed by Solomon. I understand that sacrifices could be offered after the destruction of the Solomonic temple. That is not the point. The point is, once the Levitical priesthood was established, once the cultus was established, then what? The place of sacrifice was either at the tabernacle or it was at the temple. It wasn't willy-nilly out there anywhere, somewhere. Once that tabernacle was established, men were not supposed to offer sacrifice anywhere except the tabernacle. Once Solomon built his temple, 1 Kings chapter 2, he said he was building it for the offering of sacrifices and the feast days. Once established, and Deuteronomy chapter 12, God said at least 5 times that once they entered the promised land, he was going to choose a place where, over and over and over he says this, a place where, and there they could offer sacrifice and nowhere else. He never said after that sacrifice could be offered anywhere, nor did he ever say they could be offered by anyone. This issue of the priesthood is absolutely critical. So let me go on. This whole concept of arguing, well, you don't have to have a tent or a tabernacle. All you have to do is have a tabernacle. Folks, let me say again, with all due respect, no disrespect whatsoever intended. It's double talk to say we don't need a temple, all we need is a tent. Sorry, it was not a tent that the writer of Hebrews said was standing when he wrote. It was not a tent in which the cultus was being observed when Hebrews was written. It was not a literal tent concerning which the writer said that it was standing in meats, drinks, divers washings, and would continue to stand valid and imposed until the time of Reformation. Well, what's the time of Reformation? The time for the fulfillment of the typological meaning of the feast days. Whatever it was that stood in meats and drinks and divers washings at the time Hebrews was written, whatever was standing and standing valid at that time, it was that which would stand until the fulfillment of the feast days. Sorry, that's just inescapable. Objection number 2. The men, that is the Levites, who are qualified to be priests, have been training for quite some time and are ready to serve when called upon. Now, I made the observation, and here was a response that I posted. Can you show us the genealogical records confirming that those men are of the Aaronic Levitical priesthood or lineage? Didn't try. Now, later on, this same individual posted claiming that the genealogies were not destroyed in AD 70. Well, you know, I think that's a Jewish fabrication. I know that some Jewish sources say the genealogies were not destroyed, but here's something else that I know for a fact. Paul, twice in the New Testament, said, give no heed to genealogies. So should Christians be paying attention, looking for genealogies for Levites? Or should we not rather be looking to the priesthood of Christ, which is far superior to the Levitical and Aaronic priesthood, Hebrews chapter 5 to 7, and concerning which priesthood we have the lineage and the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew and in Luke. You want to see a genealogy to pay attention to? Then look to Jesus' genealogy. There is no New Testament justification whatsoever for giving heed to genealogies about so-called Levites. By the way, I just got to make mention of this. My friend in Israel, world-renowned Hebrew scholar, I have asked him, how has anyone been able to confirm their lineage as a priest since AD 70? And he said, we do not have a way. And he said, amazingly, basically the general rule is, if a man says he is a Kohen, a Levite, we just take his word for it. Seriously? In Ezra chapter 2, 61 and 62, there were some individuals who claimed to be Levites. But guess what? A search was made through the records. Their names were not there, so they were excluded from being Levites, from serving in the temple. They could not even eat the meat sacrificed in the temple. So when someone says today, oh, well, if somebody says they're a Levite, then they're a Levite. According to Ezra chapter 2, it would not matter how many men in the Temple Institute of Jerusalem said, hey, I'm a Levite. If you don't have the genealogies, you don't serve. Next objection, this individual says, there are 5 red heifers awaiting final qualification to be used in the sacrifice. Now look, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but let me suggest that you go to my website, donkpreston.com or BibleProphecy.com, and in the search bar, type in red heifers. There are probably no less than 8 or 9 articles on there which address this. But here's the point of fact. What were the red heifers for? For the purification of the priest, for the purification of the temple, for purification from sin. Numbers chapter 19. Now, the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 10, there was in those offerings and sacrifices, which they make year by year continually, which could never make the worshiper perfect regarding the conscience. The writer says, if those sacrifices could have offered forgiveness, would they not have ceased to be offered? Okay, so the red heifer sacrifice was for cleansing, for purification. By the way, the red heifer could never offer or never objectively give forgiveness, redemption, cleansing. But the book of Hebrews says, Hebrews chapter 9, 12 and following, if the ashes of a red heifer sanctifies to the purifying of the flesh, how much more through the blood of Jesus Christ, who offered himself without spot and without blemish unto God, purge your conscience from dead works. So the blood of Christ does what the blood of the red heifer could never do. And once forgiveness, once cleansing, once redemption is actually given, those sacrifices cease to be offered. Folks, it wouldn't matter if they could find 100, absolutely 100% qualified red heifers, they could never offer cleansing. Only the blood of Christ does that. Okay, to move on very, very quickly here. The objection is offered, and I mentioned this a moment ago. Israel was promised to return to their land, which happened in 1948. Again, please go to my website, order the book, go to the store, look up the book, Israel 1948 Countdown to Nowhere. But a couple of extremely quick points here. Point number one, throughout the Tanakh, throughout the Old Testament, God always gave the condition for the return to the land. You know what that condition was? Deuteronomy chapter 30, 1 to 10, God gave the condition for Israel's return to the land if she was in captivity. They had to repent. They had to call on the name of the Lord. They had to keep the law of Moses. Well, I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, the law of Moses was removed in the first century. The law of Moses is no longer valid and binding. So the condition for Israel returning to the land no longer applies because the law no longer applies. Next objection. The objection is given, quote, the temple fell in the 500s BC, but was rebuilt and fell again in AD 70, and it is prophesied that it will be rebuilt again. This will happen after Messiah descends, returns and fights the nation. Zechariah chapter 14. Now he goes ahead and says more, but then he makes the observation and the claim after the destruction of Jerusalem that is foretold in Zechariah 14. Now, what's interesting about this is that Zechariah 14 does not predict a rebuilding of a third temple. The third temple is the Messianic temple built upon the living chief cornerstone of Jesus Christ and built upon the apostles and the prophets as the foundation, Ephesians 2, 19 and following. There is no literal, physical third temple coming. Secondly, here's what's interesting, and this is absolutely critical that you understand. Well, let me make one more observation. He says that after the rebuilding of that temple, which is not mentioned, by the way, that the nations of the earth, Gentiles included, must go to Jerusalem to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Oh, wait a minute. One more time. The law of Moses, which commanded the observance of the Feast of Tabernacles, the law of Moses is no longer in effect, ladies and gentlemen. So that means that a literalistic application of Zechariah chapter 14 of Israel or the nations going to Jerusalem and literally observing the Feast of Tabernacles is absolutely misplaced. Final point here, and that is that the book of Revelation draws extensively from Zechariah. Philip Carrington, in his book, The Meaning of Revelation, points out that Zechariah is one of the books that the book of Revelation draws from extensively. So what did Revelation have to say about the book of Zechariah? Over and over and over again, the visions of Revelation based upon Zechariah were about to be fulfilled. Now, I've pointed that out repeatedly to this individual, and to this date, he has not said one single word in response to that reality. If you're going to say, oh, well, Zechariah 14, that's got to be fulfilled, then how about honoring what John was told by the Father, that fulfillment was at hand, coming soon, coming quickly, coming shortly 2,000 years ago? You see, that's not proper exegesis. Okay, next objection. Why reject the festivals of Yahweh and embrace the festivals of Rome, for which we have no biblical example to keep? Well, in the first place, I don't know what festivals of Rome this individual is talking about. He may or may not be referring to the seventh-day Sabbath, which a lot of Torah observant people today claim was established by Rome, which is false. Christianity does not observe feast days established by Rome. So I even asked him, what feast days he was referring to, but he never gave me an answer. So, and I even wrote, I'm not sure why you talk about embracing Roman festivals. And then I made this observation. Deuteronomy 18 says that if a prophet's predictions do not come to pass, they were a false teacher. Jesus and his apostles said his coming and the end of the age was to be in the first century, not centuries or millennia later. If their predictions were not fulfilled within the time frame of quickly, shortly, soon, and at hand, from their day, they are all false teachers and prophets. And Jesus said that in the time and in the events of AD 70, quote, these be the days of vengeance in which all things that are written must be fulfilled. He wasn't talking about a period of time 2,000 years removed from those days and that time. Okay, finally, he says, Christians need to realize that Messiah and all the apostles would have been sacrificing animals in the temple throughout their whole lives. He says, as you have so brilliantly brought out, the law of Moses did not end at the cross. That is why on the day of Pentecost in Acts 2, we do not read of the apostles telling the new believers to stop offering animal sacrifices. They had undoubtedly brought animals to sacrifice with them to that feast. Even Paul participated in a ritual involving animal sacrifices directed by the Jerusalem apostles and elders. Nor at any time are believers told that the sacrificial system was abolished, which raises the issue, why does this individual not observe every single sacrificial law mandate of the law of Moses? I venture to say he doesn't. Why? Oh, well, because he doesn't have a tabernacle or a temple at which those things were mandated. Okay, my response was this. Yes, the apostles and early Christians kept going to the temple. I make that argument all the time, and I do. However, they knew that the temple was coming to an end soon. They knew that the law, the covenant, not just the temple, not just the priesthood, not just the cultus, they knew that the covenant was nigh unto vanishing away, unquote, which, by the way, this individual has completely 100% totally ignored every time I posted it. They knew that real estate values were going to plummet in the near future. Unlike Jeremiah in chapter 32, when Jeremiah purchased a piece of property but buried the record of the transaction to signify that Jerusalem would one day be restored and that the previous owner could redeem that prophecy, we have no record whatsoever of this being done by the Christians in Jerusalem. They sold their lands. They gave the money to help the poor and gave no indication of ever returning. And yes, Hebrews is emphatic and clear that the Tanakh, the temple, and the cultus was doomed to, quote, vanish away, unquote, shortly. To even suggest that we should not rely on the book of Hebrews is more than a bit concerning. And I said that because this individual said, well, you know, Hebrews was not added to the canon without controversy, and we're not really sure if we ought to pay attention to it. Well, I have trouble with that kind of an argumentation, ladies and gentlemen. Now, you can go to my website. Once again, look up the articles on the red heifer. Look up articles on the Messianic temple. Purchase a copy of my book, Israel 1948, Countdown to Nowhere. And you will soon see that every single objection that this individual, and again, this individual was just the epitome of decorum and honor, honesty and respect throughout our discussions. I appreciate that very, very much. But I think you can see the objections lodged against my book, Temple to Telos, have no merit whatsoever. Thanks for joining me. Now, tomorrow we'll get back to our examination, review, and response to Steve Gregg's book, Why Not Full Preterism? You don't want to miss that, so I'll see you on the flip side.